Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Venable's 119th Congress Trump Administration webinar series. Today, we'll be talking about the budget reconciliation process and what you need to know in the 119th Congress. I'm Nick Choate, Senior Policy Advisor here at Venable. Before this, spent about 15 years on Capitol Hill. I'm joined by one of my colleagues, Jim Barnett. Jim.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Nick is going to walk you through the reconciliation process, and I'll join you shortly for a conversation with Dr. Gary Andres, who's the staff director for the House Budget Committee. Nick, back to you.
Thank you. We'll go to the next slide. As I mentioned, this is one in a series of webinars Venable's holding about navigating policy shifts under a second Trump administration and with the new Congress. We'll look at the political landscape. Today's with a heavy focus on Capitol Hill and the legislative process known as budget reconciliation. But future sessions will explore leadership transitions, expected executive actions on any range of industries and sectors from healthcare to financial services, energy, trade, and beyond. Go ahead and move to the next slide. As I mentioned, today's focus is budget reconciliation. You have probably heard some about this in the weeks since the election, but it is an expedited process that has been used a handful of times in recent years, roughly 24 times, I believe, in all of the 40 plus years it has been in place, to enact laws dealing with fiscal issues, spending, tax issues, or the debt limit. It allows for privileged consideration of these bills, which is particularly important in the Senate, where it effectively bypasses the Senate filibuster. You only need a simple majority of votes in the Senate to pass legislation through reconciliation. And the Republicans will hold 53 seats in the Senate in January. Forgot to mention, if people do have questions as we go along, please drop them into the chat. We will try to answer questions as we go at the end, or if we need to follow up after, we're happy to do that as well. I can flip to the next slide. So as I mentioned, budget reconciliation has been used in the past. And while its original intent, when it became part of the Budget Act of 1974, was likely to allow Congress to decide we need to reduce the deficit by $10 billion and then direct committees come up with ways to do that, in recent years, it has become more of a partisan tool that allows a party, once they control the House and Senate and the White House, to move spending bills, tax bills, without the threat of a Senate filibuster, without having to get buy-in from bipartisan votes on the other side of the aisle. Probably familiar with some of these recent examples. Most recently, during the Biden administration, Democrats used it to enact the American Rescue Plan, which was the last of the COVID relief bills. I believe that one had a $1.9 trillion price tag. And they also used it the following year in 2022 to enact the Inflation Reduction Act, which included a number of provisions related to clean energy tax credits, EVs, et cetera. During President Trump's first year in office, they used it to enact the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the $1.5 trillion tax package from the Trump administration. During the Obama administration, it was used to finalize the Affordable Care Act. That was multiple legislative vehicles, but they needed the reconciliation process to finish that. And then multiple times during the second Bush administration, they used it to enact various tax cuts. As I mentioned, up until that point in time, the bills were much smaller in scope for the most part, and were generally utilized to accomplish a fiscal goal primarily. And go ahead and flip to the next slide. So the kind of the boring part of it is, how does it work? The process starts very similar to any other legislation. The House and Senate have to agree on their own bills and then come together on a compromise. But before they can even get to that, they have to, this all revolves around the budget. So they first have to agree on a budget resolution and what are called reconciliation instructions to one or more committees. Those instructions are critical for this process, because once that budget resolution passes, the committees have to stay within the confines of those instructions. So as a practical matter, what they actually have to start with is figure out what they want to use reconciliation for. For example, if Republicans want to pass tax cuts using reconciliation, they largely need to write that tax bill to know how much it's going to cost, how much of it, if any of it, they're going to offset, and then they can give the committee dollar figure targets so they can then produce that bill. A couple of recent examples in 2017, that was pure tax bill. So the instructions were pretty simple. The tax writing committees had a target of increasing the deficit by no more than 1.5 trillion. The two bills Democrats did most recently in the Biden administration were more complicated. While there were some tax provisions, they also touched a number of mandatory spending accounts. So they actually kicked instructions to nearly 24 committees combined between the House and Senate, all with very specific dollar figure targets that they had to meet or could not exceed. Once that happens, the committees with those instructions write their pieces of the bill. They come to the budget committee of each respective chamber. The budget committee rolls that all into one package, goes to the floor. The two chambers reconcile the differences, and the bill hits the president's desk. I will say reconciliation has not always been a successful process. I mean, the bills I've talked about so far were ones that were signed into law, but President Obama, I believe, vetoed one reconciliation bill, and President Clinton, I believe, vetoed 3 reconciliation bills that the Congress sent him. And perhaps more notably, in recent past, Republicans during the first Trump administration tried to use a reconciliation process to repeal the Affordable Care Act, and that ultimately failed and was shelved. Can go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, the biggest benefit of reconciliation is it allows for the bill to avoid the Senate filibuster, but it also comes with a lot of rules. One rule in particular that has a lot of components to it, the Byrd Rule, named after late Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia. And that rule's been around since 1990. And it was aimed at limiting the scope of reconciliation bills to ensure that they truly dealt with what was intended: revenues, spending, or the debt limit. And it allows senators to strike individual provisions from the bill if they don't meet that test. It also allows the bill to lose its privilege altogether if those provisions aren't struck. Which is not to say you can't do policy in a reconciliation bill, but the policy has to be tied to spending, and has to have a purpose that is primarily fiscal in nature. If we'll get to some examples here in a second that maybe further illustrate this. And the rule applies to the reconciliation bill itself, amendments to bills, and the conference report related to the reconciliation bill in the Senate. While the House itself does not have the same rules, because both chambers have to agree to the same final product, the Senate's Byrd Rule does very much inform what a final product can look like. Can flip to the next slide. Again, the Byrd Rule has been around since 1990, and it is not self-executing. A senator has to raise a point of order against a provision in order raise the question of whether it is extraneous. The presiding officer in the Senate, if they sustain the objection, it's removed. There have been examples in the past, although frankly not in the most recent reconciliation bills, but if you go back to the 80s and 90s, of provisions that almost certainly did not violate the Byrd Rule, but because no one objected, they stayed in. Under this process, the Senate parliamentarian makes the initial determination and provides that advice to the Senate's presiding officer, and that advice can be waived with the presiding officer's ruling on the advice of the parliamentarian may be waived with a 3/5 majority, which is 60 votes, which basically puts you back in filibuster territory to do anything in a reconciliation bill that doesn't meet the Byrd Rule. Can go to the next slide. So this is where we kind of get into a little more detail. And this is probably the thing we're getting the most questions about today is what, I guess the question that comes to us is what can be done through a reconciliation bill? The question that's easier to answer is what can't be done through a reconciliation bill. So it can be stricken as considered extraneous and stricken if it meets any of these tests. One, first and foremost, fails to impact outlays or revenues. So if it has no budgetary impact at all, it cannot go into a reconciliation bill. Two, fails to meet the committee's fiscal target. As I was talking about earlier with the reconciliation instructions themselves and the need to get those right, even before they pass the budget, this is what that is getting at. They need the provision to meet the fiscal targets outlined in the committee's instructions. Three is where policy and fiscal matters collide a little bit. If the provision produces only incidental budgetary effects, it is considered extraneous, which means even if it has a fiscal impact, that's not necessarily enough to mean it can stay in a reconciliation bill. They have to prove the provision's primary objective is its fiscal impact. And we'll talk in a second about a couple of recent examples that maybe make a little more sense. Four, if the provision exceeds the committee's jurisdiction, I think that one's pretty self-explanatory, increases the deficit beyond the budget window, which is usually a 10-year window, and then changes to Social Security are not allowed under the Byrd Rule, but to the retirement and disability programs under the Social Security Act, I should say. So those are the prongs of the test. As I mentioned, there are some examples that maybe help illustrate those a little better. So in the first category, no impact on outlays or revenues, the Republican tax bill back in 2017 had a proposal to expand Section 529 education savings accounts to cover expenses for homeschooling. And given that it had no fiscal impact, it had come out of the bill. This category also, you don't see sense of Congress language, you don't see policy statements in the budget reconciliation bill because, again, no fiscal impact. Let's see. I'll go ahead and kind of answer this as it came in. Someone asked if every provision needs to be scored so that the committees know whether it meets the committee's fiscal impact, which off of that last couple of bullet points, probably a good time to answer that. The short answer is yes. Like every line needs a score so that the committee knows whether it has met its instruction. On previous slide, the one I mentioned where fiscal policy and policy collide is category 3, incidental budgetary effects. In 2021, with the American Rescue Plan, which Democrats moved in the first 100 days of the Biden administration, the original House bill had a provision in it to increase the federal minimum wage to $15. And although that creates some score, has some impact on the federal budget. It was determined that its purpose was primarily policy in nature and therefore not eligible under the Byrd Rule. There were similar immigration provisions in that bill that had to come out. And not all immigration policy would necessarily be off the table, but some of the stuff Democrats were trying to do in that bill were. And then perhaps my favorite example is during the Republicans' effort to repeal the ACA, the Byrd Rule was used to remove or to prevent the repeal of the individual health mandate. Now, the Republicans did get creative with that one because while the parliamentarian ruled that outright repeal of the individual mandate violated the Byrd Rule, they came back and said, okay, we won't repeal it. We will just reduce the penalty for non-compliance to $0, which created a fiscal impact and left the otherwise standing law in place. And then category 5, as I mentioned, deficit beyond the budget window. So this is particularly important with some of the tax bills that have been done in recent years because it more or less requires that they sunset sooner than 10 years or sooner. So usually, as you can see here in recent years, with a 9-year window. Can slip to the next slide, please. So that is a general overview of the budget reconciliation process. Pretty high level. I think what Jim and Gary will get to here in a little bit is maybe a little more specifics about some of the things that are being tossed around right now. But I will, while we're doing these webinars now, this is something that is getting a lot of talk. There is no agreement today among congressional Republicans about when or what they want to use reconciliation for. One view is moving a bill early-ish, dealing with immigration, perhaps national security, energy permitting, and basically non-tax matters. And the other bill that is also being talked about, perhaps separately or perhaps combined, is a tax bill. As folks are likely aware, the Trump tax cuts expire at the end of the year, or the portions of the tax cuts expire at the end of the year. So there is an effort to extend those and perhaps make other changes to the tax code. Again, those two things could happen separately. They could happen together. They are going to potentially have multiple bites at using the reconciliation process. Right now, they have the fiscal year 25 budget available to them to pass a budget and provide reconciliation instructions. And later in the year, they'll be able to turn to the fiscal year 26 budget process.
Hey, Nick, just historically, just on timing.
Yes.
There's been kind of a mixed record, right? For instance, in the Biden administration, the American Recovery happened pretty quickly, but then the IRA wasn't signed into law until August of 22. And then going back in the Trump first term, the tax reconciliation anyway wasn't done until December of the first year of 2017. I guess the ACA repeal was a little quicker, although ill-fated than that. So a mixed record on time.
Yeah, and that is a good point. I mean, while there's certainly uncertainty with regard to timing right now, I think one big difference in why Democrats were able to move so quickly, again, I believe March 12th was the day 2021 was the day President Biden signed that bill into law. So well within his first 100 days in office. However, that bill largely existed even prior to the 2020 election as Democrats' final proposed COVID relief bill. Now, it did not get enough Republican support, so it wasn't able to move in that Congress, but they were already well underway in having their reconciliation bill written when they were sworn in that January. I will not put words in any Republican leaders' mouths, but we have not seen, similarly detailed proposals from Republicans yet as to what they want to do. And I think some of the chatter right now, and correct me if you're hearing differently, is part of the argument for potentially doing this in pieces, like Democrats did with the American Rescue Plan and then the IRA, is to do the pieces that are maybe ready to go now: immigration, energy, perhaps a few other things, and spend a little more time getting the details on tax bill right. I know there's not agreement there, but that does seem to be an argument.
Exactly. And to the extent that there's agreement on anything, I guess.
And it looks like another question came in. Yeah, what is the substance of the instructions? Are they simply dollar amounts to each committee, or do they include directions to consider specific areas? And Jim, I'll maybe let you provide a little color here too from your time at one of these committees, but generally speaking, they are dollar amounts. The budget committee actually can't tell the authorizing committees exactly what to do with that dollar amount. It is generally increase the deficit by X amount or no more than X amount, or decrease the deficit by X amount or at least Y amount. But they, for example, I'll just throw it out there that they could not tell the House Natural Resources Committee that they need to, produce $500 million in savings and do so by increasing drilling on federal lands. Like that last part of how they save the money is up to the committee.
That's exactly right. Although, I would argue that some of the policy choices are fairly baked in to the instructions, and in fact are debated on the House floor during consideration of the budget resolution itself. So it's rarely as a general matter, rarely a guessing game as to what an authorizing committee has been instructed to do.
Well, and as a practical matter, as I mentioned early on, they're basically going to write the reconciliation bill, or at least the bones of it, before they even tell the committees what the reconciliation instructions are. So even though that budget resolution itself won't tell the individual committees what specifically to do, as a practical matter, those decisions will largely have already been made. And then I have been asked to provide two reminders. One, this is available for CLE credit, and the CLE code is Reconciliation 2024. And then the other one, and you'll get a reminder of this at the end as well, but if you'd like to register for our next webinar on trade policy under a second Trump administration on tariffs, tools, and international impact, there should be a registration link, and that will be on December 17th at 2 p.m. And I guess, while we wait, if folks have any more questions, feel free to drop them into the chat. I will jump back to, one thing that I think is a relatively new factor given how the Biden administration and Democrats in Congress used the reconciliation process in 21 and 22. They were, while I wouldn't say they enacted a lot of policy, they did tie a lot of dollars to spending in a way that gave the agencies some discretion as far as rules and regs around that spending that hadn't really been previously done in reconciliations on any meaningful level before. In the past, reconciliation bills largely focused on tax and large mandatory programs like Medicare, Medicaid. So that is I know a tool that the Republicans are looking at this time. And again, the question we get probably more often than any is like, what can be done through policy on a reconciliation bill? And I think the short answer is if they can really make it about the money and give the department or the agency some flexibility in implementation, that's where you can really get, the policy changes and wins. And then
a couple more in there.
Yeah. So the decision. Could you remind me who decides whether a given budget item violates the Byrd Rule? Are there any safeguards to ensure that ruling on such question is not purely a political act? So the Senate parliamentarian is the one who provides the advice to the presiding officer in the Senate as to whether a point of order should be sustained. That is not historically a partisan role. Her advice is fairly well respected. If there are, disagreements about a ruling, perhaps there's a way to tweak it to come into compliance with the Byrd Rule, but there really aren't recent examples of the Senate overriding the parliamentarian's ruling on a Byrd Rule issue. And I frankly don't see that changing. I think they want to respect and maintain this process. I think there is a lot they can do spending and tax wise that isn't going to require going outside those bounds. So at the moment, I'm going to rely on recent history and trust that the process will be fairly clear of politics from that standpoint. Now, if they rule that a provision violates the Byrd Rule, I think they will go back and try to find a way to make that provision compliant. But trying to attach just a pure policy rider or something, I don't see happening.
Yeah, once the process gets rolling, we'll be hearing again a lot about Elizabeth McDonough, who's the Senate parliamentarian. It's a nonpartisan position. And she has a great deal of experience. She was around in 2017 and then again in the previous Congress in 21 and 22. And remember, particularly in 2021, there were some really critical battles on Byrd Rule type things. Nick mentioned the minimum wage as an example. Those were really searing debates at the time. I suspect that we'll see a good bit of that going forward also.
Okay. Thanks.
All right, Jim. Well, on that note, I will kick it over to you.
Hey, thanks, Nick. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Gary Andres, who serves as the Republican staff director of the U.S. House Budget Committee. Gary's a consummate Capitol Hill veteran. He's served also as chief of staff at the House Ways and Means Committee and at, by the way, the best committee in the Congress at Energy and Commerce. He's a graduate of Wheaton College and holds a doctorate in public policy from the University of Illinois. Gary, welcome.
Great. Hi. Thank you, Jim. Can you guys hear me okay?
Sure can.
or am I muted? There we go. Now that's good. Hi. Well, thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me and Jim talking about the best committee in Congress. I can say that I had the best general counsel in Congress when we worked together for many years at ENC. So thanks for your service and your friendship, Jim. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
What I wanted to do today was really just two things. I want to very briefly talk about some of the history that shaped where we are today, because I think that would be really helpful to frame a little bit more of a discussion about what's happening right now, and then talk a little bit about the current status and what to expect, and then be glad to answer any questions. So I'll just kind of start right in. I'll do a little bit of a history lesson, and I don't know if you've covered kind of some of this before, but I think it's important. So a few dates to keep in mind. 1974, 50 years ago, it was really the big date for budget, and that's when we created through the Congressional Budget Act a bunch of things: the Congressional Budget Office, the House and Senate budget committees, and the process that we'll be kind of talking about today. As part of that process was kind of an optional process called reconciliation, which I'll get into in a little bit. But originally, reconciliation and the budget process were used. So at the end of the year, you'd kind of take your top line spending and your top line revenues and kind of add in all the stuff that Congress did during the year and evaluate that and make adjustments so that the budget could be in balance or close to balance. It rarely, if ever, worked, and to this day, the process, which I won't go into whole detail on that, but the whole budget process and when you do appropriations and all that, none of that really works the way it was designed to work. Part of the problem, though, specifically with the budget process and reconciliation, was that it was the contemplation was that kind of as you got towards the end of the fiscal year or the end of the calendar year, you would do this reconciling process. But as Congress became increasingly, bogged down and not getting things done on time, it became impossible to do that. So that part of the whole Budget Act of 1974 really didn't work. Another kind of thing happened, which again I'll talk about a little bit near the end, is that whole process that was supposed to work and never did was actually kind of transformed even later, where reconciliation then became not so much a process to balance the budget or reconcile revenues and outlays, but it really became a process for either one party or the other to advance their own partisan political objectives. So back on reconciliation for a minute, I said it was an optional process. It was created in 1974. It actually was never even used in Congress until 1980. 1980 was the first time we did reconciliation. Since then, there have been 23 reconciliation measures that have been enacted into law. And the real, from the standpoint of a House person, reconciliation is less relevant to us. We have a rules committee that kind of clears the way and sets the stage for timing on bills and amendments that are in order and things like that. It really is a process that was designed to help expedite things in the Senate. You can pass a reconciliation bill with 50 votes plus or 51 votes in the Senate. So that was really the whole process for setting it up. And then kind of an interesting thing happened, from about 1980 to 1985. As I was saying before, it wasn't really meeting its designed objectives. But what it did do during that time is that reconciliation became a vehicle for every senator who couldn't get 60 votes for their legislation to kind of move it through the process during that way. So in 1985, Senator Byrd was very concerned about this process because, as you know, all know, the Senate's supposed to be a place where you can only pass things with 60 votes. Well, reconciliation was like kind of this loophole around the filibuster rule in many ways, where that's at least what it became, because not only were they using reconciliation for budget things, but they were adding all kinds of other extraneous measures to it. So if you go back and read the debate in 1985 about the creation of the Byrd Rule, Senator Byrd noted that in that one bill, there were 121 provisions that were extraneous to the budget process. So things had really kind of gotten out of hand. So and in 1985, on a big bipartisan vote, I think it was maybe unanimous, they passed the Byrd Rule, which I'll go into some of the details of that later, but that was a very important process development, and will be very important in the process that we look forward to this year. There was one other big event in 1985 that I think was important, and we still kind of deal with in one way or another today. And it was separate from passing the Byrd Rule, but there was a law that was passed in 1985, which we call the Gramm-Rudman-Hollings bill. And that did some kind of interesting things. It set, for example, targets for deficits, not targets for spending, but targets for deficits. And it set the goal from 1985 to 1992, so in that 7-year period, to balance the budget by deficits going down every year. And it created another process, a word that you'll hear a lot called sequestration. And it was that if Congress didn't hit those deficit targets, there would be a sequestration or an across-the-board funding cut in order to reach them. That process didn't work real well because, again, the budget deficits are impacted by so many different factors other than just even spending and revenues. They're impacted by things like interest rates and kind of assumptions about GDP growth and things like that. So it never, Gramm-Rudman-Hollings, that part about finding deficit targets or using deficit targets really didn't work either. So fast forward then to 1990, we passed something then on, I think, for those of you who are old enough to remember Read My Lips, No New Taxes. That was the bill that raised revenue that President George H.W. Bush signed. But the probably a more important part of that bill that we didn't really hear about too much at the time, because there was all the talk about breaking his word on taxes, was the creation of something called PAYGO, or pay as you go. And basically what it means is that bill set up like discretionary caps, so caps on discretionary spending, but also said that any mandatory spending in the budget would have to be offset with either tax increases or other mandatory spending changes. And that actually proved to be a very successful fiscal tool, because not too long after that, like in 1998, 1999, 2000, and 2001, we had 4 years of actual budget surpluses rather than budget deficits like we have today. In 2000, we had the largest surplus in American history, $236 billion surplus. So when we entered into the early 2000s and the Bush administration, we started out with a surplus. Fast forward one more decade, and we get to 2010, and we created something called statutory PAYGO, which is still on the books today. And one of the things that and this drives the budget hawks kind of crazy. They created something called a pay-go scorecard. And every year, or at the end of the year, if there was an increase to the deficit, that was supposed to be added to this scorecard. And then the following year, if Congress didn't address those changes and put the spending or revenue back into line, it also triggered a sequestration. So that was something that again was supposed to be a good budget fiscal tool. Since 2010, so for all the however many years that's been, 15 years or so, even though there's been deficits put on the pay-go scorecard, it's the sequestration that's supposed to follow it is literally never been used once. This year, for example, there is $1.9 trillion on the pay-go scorecard. So that was increases to the deficit that were actually enacted as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act and the American Recovery Act. One of the final acts of Speaker Pelosi when she left office after the 2022 election was to push that pay-go scorecard to December of 2024, which we are going to be dealing with in this Congress. And again, the way it would work is that there would have to be a sequestration in January to cut funding to make up that money. The problem is that it's gotten so big, that 1.9 trillion is so big that even if you did there's a cap on how much you can cut Medicare, a 4%. If you did a 4% Medicare cut and literally wiped out every single other program that's in what they call the sequestrable base, or the things that could be cut, wiped them out to zero, just zeroed them out. Commodity Credit Corporation, other kinds of programs like that, you raise about $130 billion. So less than 10% of what Congress should be cutting. So that is an issue that we will be addressing here in the next couple weeks. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was the kind of the current process and the Byrd Rule. We are going to be doing a budget resolution. There's a debate going on right now about whether or not we would do one budget resolution and followed by a reconciliation, or two budget resolutions next year, followed by a reconciliation. I'll give you kind of the arguments on both sides, or the state of the debate. If we did one, the argument is that the House and Senate budget committees would do a budget resolution, maybe give reconciliation instructions to spend money on border funding, for example, and maybe on defense, and then another budget resolution a little bit later in the year, and probably start again with the second budget resolution in the spring. The first one would be for fiscal year 25. We could also do one for fiscal year 26, which would be the one where we would probably do reconciliation instructions to deal with the expiration of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and then any other kinds of mandatory spending changes that we could use to kind of offset that. So when we get into that process, though, the Byrd Rule will become very important. There are a number of features of the Byrd Rule that are pretty straightforward. A reconciliation bill has got to either increase or decrease outlays or revenues. That you can't have a committee that doesn't have jurisdiction over a policy, promote a policy in that area. So the Senate Health Committee can't propose a tax increase, for example, because that's in the jurisdiction of the Finance Committee. The most ambiguous part of the Byrd Rule, and the thing where the Senate, both the authorizing staff and leadership staff, are going to be spending most of their time over early next year, is on something we call the merely incidental provision. And that is, again, the way the Byrd Rule was structured, it was really trying to focus on budgetary items, not policy items. So even if there's a policy that does have some budgetary impact, if that budgetary impact is what the parliamentarian would determine as merely incidental, it gets birded out. It gets dropped from the procedure. So those are things, we have been spending a lot of time with our Senate colleagues looking at different kinds of policy options and trying to figure out which ones would pass that, all the tests and whatever. And I think we're pretty well prepared on a number of fronts to do that. I'm just kind of waiting for some further kind of direction from our leadership about how they want to go, both in terms of the substance and the timing of things. So Jim, I know I've gone on for a while here, and I know there's going to probably have some questions. So I'm glad to open it up.
Fantastic. Thanks, Gary. I want to get into some of the process for next year, but a couple of things just on your committee's sort of internal dynamics. Chairman Arrington stays on in the 119th, and Ranking Member Boyle stays on as well. How much turnover within the membership of your committee on the R side and the D side?
Yeah, so I don't know if I have the exact count on the D side, but on our side we have 4 members who are either we have Bob Good from Virginia, who lost his primary. We have Michael Burgess, who's retiring, and I think they have a similar number of members, but I think it's about 4. We have 4, and I think they have around 5.
Yeah. And you think the ratio now is 21-16? You think you keep that going forward?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, if past is prologue, since the ratio in the House, only shifted, marginally from the last Congress, I think we'd probably keep it the same.
So not quite Ways and Means ratios, but
right, yeah,
at least some margin for
on
the Republican side.
Yeah, not much, but
the word is that Speaker Johnson is scheduled a rare Saturday conference for January 4th to talk about all things reconciliation. It's going to be competing with some football contests, I suspect. But is it safe to assume that kind of all bets are off on any sort of definitive plan until the members have gotten in a room and hashed things out?
Yeah, I think so, and I think one of the things that I've observed since coming back after Thanksgiving was just having the members back in town. Shouldn't be that surprising. There's a lot of different opinions about what we should do and where we should go, and lots of the ideas that we've had at kind of the staff level, and we've talked about our may go in different directions here, but I do think that that there's going to be, I think the speaker has said he's going to be talking to President Trump on this Saturday about some things. I think we'll get some more direction on where to go early on. I think one of the things that that some people have talked about in the press already is that there is a a little bit of a difference of opinion between where the Senate is and where some in the incoming White House staff are, and some of the House people. And I think the thinking there is that, given the narrow majority that we have I've said this a couple times now. I've heard people saying it feels really odd to even say it because I've never been through anything like this before, is that we actually have a narrower majority in the House than they do in the Senate, which is kind of a strange thing. Yeah, I think that it'd be good to kind of get that direction, and we'll kind of go from there. But I think the thinking on the part of people like Chairman Smith at the Ways and Means Committee is that, given how narrow our majority is, it's going to be really hard to pass, a tax bill. And there are lots of different ideas about, what, can or cannot be done on things like SALT or some of the green energy tax credits. And, I think as some of those have been rolled out more into the marketplace, that's been maybe, the idea of just kind of repealing everything as if it gets more challenging. So there's all kinds of there's issues about whether or not it can, a reconciliation bill on the tax stuff can raise the deficit or not. If it can't raise the deficit, you've got to find, $4 or $5 trillion in offsets. How does that affect the politics of the package? So it's a very, it would be complicated under any kind of circumstances. It's incredibly complicated, with a 2-seat majority.
Right.
And I think, like, from Chairman Smith's perspective, and I think he makes a good point, that the more things that you can put in a package like that might be attractive to members outside of tax, whether it be, border funding, whether it be, energy deregulation, things like that, it raises the probability of us being able to pass it. I think if you take a number of those things out, I think his view, and I think the view of a number of people, is that it makes it more difficult to pass. So that's kind of the debate we're having right now.
Yeah, let me just play that out a little bit, because it seems to me that there's not only is there some indecision or dispute, honest differences over a one package, two package thing, but really neither one of those packages is kind of fully baked out. It seems to me, if you look back at the some recent examples we were discussing earlier, the American Recovery Plan. Lots of democratic ideas that were fairly well baked going into their takeover in that Congress. And similarly, it was an ill-fated effort on the Obamacare repeal back in 2017. I mean, the rough contours anyway of what Republicans wanted to do. Here, it seems to me, on the tax front, it's basically an extension of the Trump tax cut, but as you say, a lot of complications. And then on other sort of more policy related things, energy, immigration, and so forth, there have been, particularly in the House, legislative efforts in the last couple of years, but certainly nothing that has gotten a lot of traction in the Senate. So it's both a timing and a substantive issue. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, again, taking the perspective of where I think the Senate has been on this, I think, recognizing those, those various kind of challenges or obstacles, whatever you want to call them. I think they're thinking like a bill, a budget resolution and reconciliation bill that's kind of very focused right off the bat on something that most of the Republicans or all the Republicans could agree on, which probably be something on, additional border funding, is given the saliency of that issue during the election. I think the thinking is that, like, let's kind of get a win first on something that is not that controversial from the standpoint of our own caucus or our own conference, and then the other stuff is going to probably take a while to to figure that out. And I think rather than having us kind of swirl around for, 3 or 4, 5 months. I think the thinking is like get a quick win first and then focus immediately on those other things, and hopefully those things can get worked out by the early summer, late spring.
Yeah. How does particularly given that timing, how does the debt limit play into all this, if at all? Debt limit, of course, expires January 1. We'll do these time-honored extraordinary measures for a few months after that, but does that come in?
Yeah, I don't think it'll really be a part of the reconciliation process. My guess is that that will be kind of a separate negotiation or separate process. I mean, theoretically, we could use reconciliation to raise the debt limit. That is, one of the things that the law says you can use it for. They said that you can use it to impact outlays, you can use it to impact revenues, or you can use it to impact the debt limit. So those are the three categories that are laid out in the statute. But I do think at the end of the day, whatever happens on the debt limit will be a bipartisan, kind of like it was this last go around with the Fiscal Responsibility Act in 2023. So my guess is that there'll be a separate negotiation that deals with raising the debt limit that is outside of reconciliation. That's just my guess at this point in time.
Got it. You mentioned the Byrd Rule, which sort of hangs over the whole reconciliation process. Any good counsel for our audience on how to deal with their policy issues, particularly in the House? What's kind of your view on looking ahead to the Byrd Rule during the House process?
I say this only half jokingly, but never talk about it as good policy. Talk about it, the fiscal consequences of what you want to do, because that is the key to passing the Byrd Rule test. And if even saying things like, well, this is a really good policy, we should do this, and it also like saves money or whatever, that's not good. It's like, we're doing this because we want to impact outlays, or we want to impact revenues. That's the whole reason for doing it. And even if that's not the whole reason for doing it, that's the how you talk about it. And I would even advise people that because I've never been in the bird bath myself, but I've spent a lot of time talking to my Senate colleagues and stuff like that, and they tell me that when things are mentioned in the press about a certain policy change and how it's going to be used in or try to get through reconciliation, those articles and kind of pointing to how this is really just all about policy, not about money, are sometimes brought to those meetings and presented to the parliamentarian as evidence that these changes are merely incidental. The revenue or the outlay changes are merely incidental to the policy.
Great. Gary, we're right at the hour. Thank you so much for your time and words of wisdom.
Yeah.
And good luck.
Great. Thanks, Jim. And good luck to everybody. Keep in touch.
Thank you. We'll wrap things up here. Just one quick reminder on the CLE credit. That code is Reconciliation 2024. I'm hoping that you all will consider joining our additional webinars. There's one next week on trade. So please register for those and participate. Some really good folks who know what they're talking about coming ahead. Nick, if you're on, anything more? Great. Thank you, everybody.